Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this EPC policy dialogue on the topic of re-engaging Iran towards a transatlantic approach. I have to say that we've gathered a really great group of experts to discuss prospects for the US-Iranian relationship following the election of Joe Biden as president. Biden has said that he would like to improve relations with Iran, including re-entering the JCPOA, otherwise the Iranian nuclear deal. But for many reasons, I don't think this is going to be particularly straightforward. We are also going to look at the implications and impact of forthcoming presidential elections in Iran, along with prospects for a joint approach with the EU, something that was impossible during the Trump presidency. I would also like to flag up that the EPC will be much more active on the Middle East and North Africa region going forwards in terms of both events and publications. Given the importance of the region for the EU, my colleague Mihai Chihaia, who will be moderating today's event and who joined our Europe in the World team as a policy analyst in December, will be primarily working on enhancing the EPC work in this area. So you can expect to be invited to many more events and read many more pieces from the EPC in the coming months, which I'm particularly happy about. And with that said, I would now like to hand over to Mihai to introduce the topic in more detail, to introduce our esteemed speakers today, and to move ahead with the debate. So over to you, Mihai.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and just a warm welcome to everyone to this policy dialogue on Iran, the future of nuclear deal, the US and EU future policy and engagement with Iran. The Biden administration, which is taking office in the next days, has signaled its intentions to return to a path of diplomacy with Iran, to return to a nuclear deal. This might seem a very straightforward path, but there are many issues that must be discussed and must be taken into account when approaching this issue. Aspects such as the fact that the nuclear issue is just part of a strategy towards Iran. There are other important aspects that need to be addressed. There are different views in Washington regarding how to tackle a future policy on Iran. There are also different views in Tehran. There is also a regional situation that presents many challenges. And at the same time, there is also the need to discuss the US cooperation in this regard. So we see there is a variety of cross-cutting issues and key questions that need to be addressed. Key questions such as what are the next steps? What are the next priorities after the Biden administration takes over? What are the main challenges? How Iran will approach the Biden administration? What's their goal? How will a return of the US to the nuclear deal impact the regional security dynamics? And what will be the role of the EU? Well, fortunately, I don't have to answer these questions or tackle these issues. That's why we have here today a brilliant panel with us, comprising of Trita Parsi, who is the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. He's a distinguished expert on Iran and on the Middle East. Then secondly, we have Michael Singh, who is the Senior Fellow and Executive Director at the Washington Institute, also with a very big experience on the Middle East, also working for previous administrations. Then we also have with us the Member of European Parliament, Mr. Ernest Urtasun, who's also the Rapporteur for the EU-Iran relations. And last but not least, we also have Aniseh Bassiri Tabrizi with us, who's a Senior Research Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, who has a long experience on working on Middle East issues. Now, before I just turn to our panel, I just have to touch upon a few logistical aspects. If I may, each speaker will make a few introductory remarks, then I'll have some questions for them, and then we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. There are basically two ways to answer a question. You have at the bottom of your screen, the button raise your hand. You can raise your hand and I'll give you the floor and you can ask directly your question, or you can type your question in the Q&A section and I'll read it out loud and see to which panelist is directed. And with this being said, I'll not take any more time. I'll just give the floor to Trita for some opening remarks. Trita, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to you, Amanda, and to you, Mihai, and the Center for organizing this. It's a great pleasure to be with you virtually. This is a very important issue, and I'm glad that conversations about it are intensifying. Let me just start off by giving a couple of background comments and just a little bit also about how I think the path forward likely will look. The Trump administration came in with a very, very negative view of the Iran nuclear deal. It had several different motivations. Trump's own obsession with undoing anything that had Obama's signature on it, but also because of the advice given to the Trump administration by countries such as the Saudis, the UAE, Israel, who made the argument that Obama's biggest mistake was that he simply started diplomacy 6 months too early and lifted the sanctions 6 months too early. If he had just gone forward with sanctions for another 6 months, the Iranian economy would have broken, the Iranians would have had to capitulate, and a much better deal could be achieved. So for Trump, who was obsessed with the idea of outdoing Obama, this became a compelling argument as to how he should approach this issue, go for sanctions much, much firmer than what the Obama administration had done, and then only relent at a time when the Iranians have really been weakened, ostensibly nevertheless, in order to be able to get a better deal. This did not end up working the way that he had thought. It was quite predictable that it wouldn't work this way, because at the end of the day, the sanctions pain was not the key thing that managed to get the nuclear deal in the first place. It was primarily the willingness on all sides to be able to compromise after having exhausted their coercive tools and realized that coercion alone would not be able to get to the end point. So after 3.5 years of very, very intense sanctions, frankly, far more painful to the Iranian economy than what Obama managed to impose on the Iranians, probably the most painful sanctions that the US ever has imposed on a country. The track record is quite clear. The Iranian program has not only continued, at some aspects it has expanded, because the Iranians have also reduced their obligations to the JCPOA in response to the American breach of the agreement. According to the Trump administration itself, Iran's regional activities have in no way, shape, or form subdued. On the contrary, they have expanded even further. So on every metric that the administration of Trump put forward that they wanted to see change, the opposite has happened, and the Iranians have not backed down an inch. Now comes the Biden administration. And early on, there were arguments that were heard, both from those who opposed the deal in the first place, but also some of the supporters of the deal, who argued that Biden should not be lifting the sanctions and he should not go back into the deal quickly. Rather, he should use the leverage that Trump has created, meaning the sanctions, in order to get a better deal. Ostensibly, that would end up putting Biden in the same situation as Trump. He too would breach the deal, call that leverage, and try to get a better deal by being outside of the deal. As I understand it, this position has been rejected. This is not the path that the Biden administration is likely to take. On the contrary, they have been quite clear. They're looking for compliance, meaning both sides comply with the deal fully, meaning from the American side that the sanctions need to be lifted, and all other measures in order to make sure that the US is in good standing with the agreement. The Iranians need to reverse many of the measures that they have taken. Fortunately, most of those seem to be quite easy to reverse. And then negotiations will begin. The benefit of this approach, on the one hand, is that it would really differentiate Biden from Trump. Moreover, it would be a way to avoid touchy issues such as the Iranians demanding compensation for the pain that they have suffered through the breach of the agreement under Trump. But moreover, it would also ensure that the Iranians would not fully go down the path of building their own leverage. If the US argument is that a breach of an agreement and the imposition of what essentially would be sanctions that would violate the agreement constitute leverage, well, then the Iranians know exactly what they need to do, because they've done it before. They will aggressively expand the program and use that as leverage for a future negotiation. Knowing how tricky the negotiations were last time around, it would be quite inconceivable that the second time around it would run smoother and would be easier and would actually be able to reach a consensus in time. As a result, the Biden administration has calculated that it's simply better for them to go quickly back into the deal as quickly as can be done. And of course, this is also partly due to the fact that the Iranians are having their elections in June. And after that, there's a likelihood that there will be a hardline president in Iran, which may not be as adhering to this deal. In fact, there's a high likelihood that the next president of Iran will be a conservative who, much like Trump, will run on a platform of rejecting the nuclear agreement. In order to avoid that and put the US in a position of not being the cause of whatever breakdown can come later on, it makes sense for the United States to get back into the deal before the Iranian elections. Having said that, it does not mean that the Biden administration is likely to turn a blind eye to some concerns and demands that have been raised both internally in the United States as well as some of the security partners of the US who never favored a deal in the first place, whether that is ballistic missiles or restrictions on the nuclear deal that exist within the deal but that are not sufficient in the reading of some. The approach of the Biden administration appears to be that as soon as they have managed to get back into the deal and compliance for compliance has been achieved, new negotiations will begin on what they call add-on agreements. Those add-on agreements will primarily first focus on nuclear aspects themselves, particularly the restrictions that have been argued are too short and they want to expand them, partly arguing that time has been lost because, again, of the American breach. This will be intended to be done rather quickly because I think there's a realization that time is not on the side of the agreement in the sense that the basis of the agreement needs to be strengthened and the best way of strengthening that is to actually have these add-on agreements. A crucial difference, though, beyond the fact that, of course, the US would be seeking a renegotiation, essentially, of some aspects of this within the deal, is that it would be separate from the deal, meaning if these negotiations fail, it does not mean the automatic collapse of the JCPOA. The JCPOA essentially is insulated away from these add-on agreements, particularly the add-on agreements that will deal with regional matters. So the JCPOA will not be held hostage to negotiations over Syria or Yemen or other aspects in the region where the US and Iran don't see eye to eye. And this is a crucial difference at the end of the day, because it means that you can pursue these regional negotiations quite extensively and aggressively without risking the collapse of the JCPOA. So the JCPOA will be protected and insulated from this. Personally, I think that this is the right path to move forward. I think that's right. I am a bit concerned that moving very fast when it comes to renegotiating certain aspects of the nuclear deal, I'm wondering how that may be perceived on the Iranian side, in the sense that it will come across as a renegotiation very quickly after the US is back into the deal. I'm pretty sure that a lot of folks in Washington would react somewhat negatively if the Iranians try to renegotiate the deal very quickly after coming back in. So there's some political aspects of this that is quite important. But I think the main concerns are, A, what will the countries that have done everything they can for the last couple of years to make sure that this deal collapses, including what the Israelis have done just in the last couple of months? Just yesterday, the Washington Post reported that Benjamin Netanyahu has been pressing Trump to strike at the Iranian nuclear deal militarily before Biden comes in as a last blow to the program, which probably would have the aim of either starting a broader war or making sure that the Iranian reaction just kills any political opportunity for a compliance return to the JCPOA. So on the one hand, there's that concern, and some of these countries have argued that they should be part of the nuclear deal and that their interests have not been represented. I fear that they have disqualified themselves from being able to be part of the nuclear deal, mindful of their conduct in the last couple of years. There's no reason to have any confidence that they actually would favor reaching any form of a deal. The details of it is not as important as the negative thing that they see in the US and Iran actually coming to some form of an agreement. However, having said that, I do think that it is crucial for the add-on agreements that deal with Persian Gulf security, for instance, that countries such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE and others are included in those negotiations, because at the end of the day, that is directly related to their security, and it would be quite incomplete to be able to have any negotiation on these matters without them at the table. But that is quite separate from having them being part of a nuclear negotiation that they have spent significant amount of time and resources trying to sabotage. Whether they have the openness for being able to participate in such negotiations on regional matters remains to be seen. The example of Syria is not, unfortunately, particularly encouraging, mindful of the fact that after the JCPOA, the Obama administration tried to move forward with inclusive negotiations on Syria through the Geneva track, and there was significant resistance from the Saudis, who did not want to see the Iranians at the table. Whether the Saudi position has changed or not remains to be seen, but the ascent of the Biden administration may in and of itself cause a newfound pragmatism in Riyadh. Last point I'll make, though, is I think if the administration seeks to include matters such as missiles, etc., and incidentally, I think it's quite crucial to see that some of the language they have been using has not been on missiles themselves as much as it has been on the proliferation of missiles, which are two different issues. I think it will be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to get the Iranians to disarm their missiles, mindful of the fact that the Iranians are spending 1/5 of the amount of money on military as the Saudis are doing, for instance, and missiles is essentially their core defense. The proliferation of missiles, meaning that the Iranians would be selling it or giving it to allied organizations in the region, is a different matter. And I think that is something that certainly needs to be addressed. But to do so, there also needs to be inducements on the American side that need to be put on the table. The ideal one would be, of course, that the US itself would stop arming some of the countries in the region to the teeth, mindful of the fact that the Persian Gulf countries are spending more money on arms than any other region in the world. But other things can also be put on the table if that is deemed to be too difficult. And one thing that was not put on the table last time around in the JCPOA was the primary sanctions that the US has imposed on Iran. The sanctions that were lifted were secondary sanctions, sanctions that the US imposed on other countries doing trade with Iran. Primary sanctions, the sanctions that affect American companies, were never really addressed. That actually provides the US with significant amount of maneuverability in the negotiations, and it could make significant demands of the Iranians if that is put on the table. The Obama administration decided that they didn't want to go down that route for a variety of reasons. We can get into that in the Q&A. But the Biden administration may calculate that that is actually something that they want to explore, because if we're going to ask for more of the Iranians, there has to be put something else on the table in return, because this is, at the end of the day, a negotiation and not an extortion. And the primary sanctions might be a very useful tool for the US to put on the table, would also provide some benefits for American companies who otherwise have no interest in this negotiation and had no interest in seeing the JCPOA defended afterwards, because it provided them with no benefits. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Trita. This has been very, very insightful and a very good scene setter to showing us how things evolve and what could happen next. I would maybe have two questions for you at this point, just to pick up on the compliance for compliance approach that you mentioned. What are the challenges of this approach? And secondly, back in 2015, there was a mindset around the nuclear deal, a mindset of a diplomacy, a mindset of dialogue, a mindset of compromise. Is that mindset still there? Or if not, how can we bring it back? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mihai. The two excellent questions. On the first issue of some of the challenges is sequencing. We saw that in the previous negotiations. The Iranians demand that the US move first because the US was the one that breached the agreement. I think the Biden administration would like to see the Iranians at a minimum move simultaneously. There's some technicalities there. I'm pretty confident that that will not be difficult to resolve. Some of the biggest issues actually already have been resolved. The fact that both of them are now talking about compliance for compliance. The Iranians are saying that they're essentially dropping the idea of compensation for now. And even the fact that some of the signals that are being sent are not about the negotiations to get into the JCPOA, but are actually they're posturing for the post-JCPOA negotiations. That to me signals that track 2 and other types of indirect conversations may already have managed to resolve some of the technical issues. Some of them remain, however. Sanctions relief is not something that the United States is particularly good at. The US is very good at imposing sanctions, but the experience of the JCPOA showed quite clearly lifting sanctions is a completely different matter. Even before Trump came in, the US had difficulties fully implementing the JCPOA because of this lack of experience when it comes to sanctions relief. Now there's even more sanctions. How can that be done in a timely manner so that the US actually is in full compliance within the time frame of 2 or so months that the administration calculates that it has? Moreover, there may be some aspects of that on the Iranian side as well, with some of the measures that they've taken when it comes to the nuclear program that may be more difficult to be able to reverse in a timely fashion. Nevertheless, I'm pretty confident that that can be resolved because it is at the end of the day a matter of political will. On to the next issue of the mindset of diplomacy. I think that's a very good point. I would say that from the side of the US, most of the folks that are coming into top positions in the administration are people who were deeply involved in the JCPOA and definitely have that mindset, have a sense of ownership of the JCPOA. And incidentally, I think 3-4 years after the JCPOA now are actually far more confident about the value of the JCPOA than they were before. Not that they weren't before, but before there wasn't a track record of being able to show that it actually did work. It was a projection, it was a calculation. Now we have 4 years of experience in knowing quite well it did work. The Iranians did comply, at least until the United States breached the agreement. And as a result, I think they're far more confident in the JCPOA than they were before. The challenge may end up being on the Iranian side after the JCPOA. The experience of the last couple of years have been a very bitter one for the Iranians because they did comply with the agreement. And even though all the talk before the JCPOA was how to make sure that the Iranians don't breach the agreement, it turned out that it actually was the US itself that did so. So, and that did not just leave a reality in which the Iranians started to become skeptical about the idea of negotiating over the nuclear issue or negotiating with the United States, but rather starting to question the value of negotiating with the West as a whole because of some of their disappointment on how the Europeans, in their view, failed to defend the deal. So again, I think that's part of the reason why I think the administration would like to see the compliance to come into effect before the Iranian elections, precisely because of the uncertainty that those elections provide in terms of who will be governing Iran after that election and what will their attitude be, not just to nuclear talks, but to diplomacy with the West as a whole.
Thank you very much, Trita. Now I will just move to you, Mike, because I know you have also some other views that you can bring into discussion. Over to you.
Thank you, Mihai. It's a pleasure to be with everyone. I'm going to keep my remarks quite brief so that we can get some questions on this topic. There's a lot to cover, obviously, on this issue. You know, I think that Joe Biden will come into office really with two main objectives with Iran that he's articulated. One that he's articulated explicitly, one which might be more implicit. The first is to strengthen the 2015 nuclear deal, to extend it and to make it more robust, more comprehensive. This, ironically, is the same goal that President Trump had. And so we have, despite all the rancor in Washington on Iran, we actually have now bipartisan agreement, in a sense, that the JCPOA is not a sufficient agreement and does need to be built upon, which was not the view in 2015 by those who were advocating it. And so that's, in a sense, progress of a sort. The second objective, which is more implicit, is to avoid allowing the Iran issue to derail his broader national security agenda, which is not focused on the Middle East, but is instead focused on what one might call great power competition or strategic competition with Russia and China. And so the question before him is how to accomplish both of these goals at the same time. And I would argue this leads to sort of maybe three important, well, many important, but let's say three important questions for the purposes of this discussion. One is, how do you get to that stronger, longer nuclear agreement with Iran? And there are a lot of different views on this. The view that Joe Biden himself has put forward is the one that Trita just explained, which is that you start with so-called compliance for compliance as a stepping stone to a second negotiation, a broader negotiation over what some people call a JCPOA2 or a JCPOA plus. I think that this itself raises a lot of other questions. One is a compliance for compliance deal possible? It would need to be choreographed in a sense so that the US and Iran reach some agreement as to how that reentry is accomplished. Obviously, the United States reentry involves sanctions waivers, which are relatively easily accomplished. It's not automatic, but it's relatively easy. Iran's reentry would require it to step back from various nuclear activities, and which would then have to be verified by the IEA. That's a slightly longer timeline, likely. And so the reentry would require the US and Iran, perhaps through a mediator, to determine how that will come to pass. The bigger question, though, I would argue, is how do you then proceed to the subsequent negotiation? What leverage does the United States have in that negotiation, and what is Iran's objective in that negotiation? In the JCPOA negotiations, I think we can say that Iran was aiming first and foremost to get sanctions relief, but in addition to preserve and legitimize its nuclear capabilities that it had built up painstakingly, frankly, over the years. With sanctions relief in hand, with its nuclear capabilities preserved, what would Iran be looking for in that negotiation? And what would the United States and our partners have to induce Iran or compel Iran to come to the table to give up what are, as Trita noted, very sort of strategic and important capabilities that Iran has? I'm not sure that that's quite clear. I'm not sure that it's been carefully considered. And it would need to be as part of this strategy. The real risk is that you sort of get back to the JCPOA and then find that that second negotiation never really materializes. The Iranians themselves have expressed far less enthusiasm for it than the United States or France or the UK have. The second question is, how do you then make whatever diplomacy you achieve, whatever deal you achieve, sustainable? Given what we've seen in the United States, where President Trump came in and withdrew from the JCPOA, and where Republican opposition to the JCPOA is near unanimous, how can you ensure that there's some element of bipartisanship in the US approach to this issue? Again, probably what happens is if you go straight back to the JCPOA, it's going to be difficult to gain any Republican support for that policy. Because for better or worse, this issue has become one that transcends substance and has a lot of political symbolism. It would be, I think, difficult for Republican members of Congress, even those who, might otherwise be sympathetic, to support a return to the 2015 nuclear deal without any modifications. I think President Biden would have an easier time getting Republican support for a strategy that didn't involve a return to the JCPOA as a first step. We may, various people who are listening may not like the idea that Republican support is necessary, but in any negotiation, the sort of presence of a sufficient domestic coalition to sustain a policy, whether you're talking about the United States or any other country, frankly, is just a vital element. And so it can't be ignored. There is a tendency when we talk about this issue to focus exclusively on the sort of international aspects of the negotiation and to treat the domestic aspects of the negotiation as irritants rather than vital elements. But in fact, that's what they are. The third question is, how do you, as the United States, address Iran's other troubling regional behaviors while offering sanctions relief? If you offer Iran comprehensive sanctions relief in exchange for a return to compliance with the JCPOA, you're essentially depriving yourself of your most powerful sanctions tools. And at the same time, of course, my guess is that we'll see a Biden administration that is reluctant to intervene militarily in the Middle East, because, as I noted, the broader national security strategy focuses elsewhere. And this would leave the United States really without many tools in the region to counter Iran's behavior. And so we would need to think about how to nest or how to put this Iran strategy, Iran policy, in the context of a sort of sensible overall Middle East strategy. Likely that's going to require a concerted effort to strengthen American partnerships in the region, strengthen American allies in the region as a means of countering Iran's policies in places like Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere. Again, this starts from a challenging point, given that the Biden administration may begin with less than sort of cordial relations with the likes of Riyadh or even Israel, where opposition to a U.S. return to the JCPOA is likely to be strong. So I think these are really the conundrums that the Biden administration will face with this compliance for compliance approach. Where does all of this point? I think where all this really points is it would be more difficult, but better from a sort of strategic point of view to skip compliance for compliance and go straight to the negotiation of a stronger deal. The problem with that is America's negotiating partners are pushing in the opposite direction. And so there'd be some international opposition to doing that from the P5+1 and certainly from Iran. And second, it's simply not clear that a bigger, more comprehensive deal is even possible, that's something that you could get Iran to sign on to. And for better or worse, you need Iran's acquiescence to any deal you're going to reach. I think what we can say overall is that we're likely to see an end to sort of the search for silver bullets that we've seen in American policy. I think if to the extent the Obama administration saw diplomacy as a silver bullet, sort of opening up a sort of broader rapprochement with Iran, and to the extent the Trump administration saw pressure or sanctions as a silver bullet that would sort of compel or force Iran to accept its demands, I don't think we're likely to see that from the Biden administration. I think we're entering a period where this will be a problem less to solve and more to manage over time as the United States prioritizes other issues. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for bringing new points into discussion. Now, I think there are even more issues that we need to address and most likely will address in the Q&A session. I'll maybe just turn a little bit to the regional situation. And my question would be, how the US can balance the relations with Israel and the Gulf allies on one hand, and on the other hand, its approach towards Iran?
Well, look, I think that when it comes down to it, the United States actually shares most of the sort of interests and objectives that these partners of ours have. None of us want to see Iran develop a nuclear weapon. None of us wish to see Iran, sort of engaged as it is in places like Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and so forth. What we have, I think, are different priorities for Israel and for the United States. I think the nuclear program of Iran is a priority. For the Gulf states, it seems that Iran's regional activities are a greater priority. And of course, very different views of how to address these issues. And of course, the American view changes over time quite significantly, which adds another layer of complexity for our partners in the region. There isn't a great deal of consistency in the American approach, at least in recent years. There was, I would argue, prior to the past 8 to 10 years, let's say. I think what this means is when you have shared objectives, but different tactics, different approaches, maybe different priorities, what you need to do is you need to get together with those allies and you need to, in a sense, negotiate with them as well. You need to sit down and see if you can't come up with a common approach. And that requires, just as it does with your adversaries, a bit of give and take. And it may require doing things outside the context of negotiations. As I said, trying to strengthen those partners so that they can face Iran with greater confidence as part of an overall strategy towards Iran. I think, though, it also requires clarity on our part. So for example, when we talk about negotiating regional issues with Iran, what do we mean? The United States and Iran can't negotiate a solution to Syria, for example. As Trita noted, I think there are many other actors. And even if we sat down and agreed on something, it couldn't be enforced on the ground because other actors will have a say as well. When our partners here is talking about negotiating over Gulf security, well, of course, they have a greater stake in Gulf security than the United States does. And so we have to be careful about how we talk about these issues and how we involve our partners in these issues. But honestly, that's just diplomacy 101. That's not unique to this issue. It just so happens that it's something that I think we have often forgotten in the past on this issue. That, if you don't include those who have an ability and sort of a incentive to themselves play a role in the issue, well, then you won't really have solved it. If you take a look at a country like Israel, Israel has both the will and the capability to act itself against Iran. And so any solution that doesn't include Israel or sort of take account of Israel's concerns is not likely to be a solution that's sustainable. the United States can't simply impose its will either on adversaries or on allies.
Thank you very much. Now maybe I would turn the discussion to Mr. Urtasun. Ernest, if I may, we will bring a view from the EU. Please, over to you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting Mihai, and it was very interesting to hear previous speakers. I will try to bring a bit more the how we see things from the European Parliament's perspective and the debate we've been having in the last months. I think that we are all aware that we are going through a very difficult period, and that of course the Biden administration will have to face a complicated situation with different elements. There is beyond Iran, we have a whole geopolitical realignment promoted by the last months of the Trump administration, who of course has a very direct effect on the relations with the country. Secondly, the worrying political developments inside Iran as well, and the prospects of having a more hardliner administration in Iran after the elections in June. And then also, I think it's I will join my voice to the previous speakers who noted the failure of the maximum pressure policy. I think this is something which is clear. We have never been as close to a nuclear Iran as we are today. And I think those are elements that put the whole situation and the new period that will probably be open with the Biden administration into a difficult scenario. I think that the EU so far, and it has been mentioned before, what it has basically tried in the last months, I would say, is basically to save JCPOA. It has managed to save it institutionally, but effectively it didn't manage to make Iran respect its components. And that was basically because I think that some of the measures that the Iranians were expecting from Europe, and particularly the mechanisms put in place to overcome the US sanctions, and particularly Instex, which was supposed to allow economic operators from Europe to operate in Iran, overcoming those sanctions, hasn't worked properly. I mean, Instex has been a tool that has allowed in the most difficult periods to provide humanitarian assistance to Iran, but the whole project of having a system that would allow broader economic operations with the country has failed. And I think this is what prompted probably a sense that the Europeans have lacked short in defending the whole agreement. In general, I think that for the EU, one of the lessons of the last month is probably that it was incorrect just to try to save JCPOA, waiting for a new US administration to come without taking further initiatives and without going more into the diplomatic offensive. And I think this is one lesson which is important for the future. I think that, of course, we are expecting a lot for the Biden administration, but Europe needs to be more assertive and have a more autonomous position when it comes to the different efforts that it does in the region. Now, what can we expect from the Biden administration? I think that the previous speakers know much more than I about that. Our impression, and I will join the comments that Amanda Paul made at the beginning, is that of course the lifting of the sanctions and the resumption of the JCPOA will not be automatic. We are not expecting that. I think what we are probably going to enter is a kind of transitional period. And here the EU needs to ask itself, what can we do in that transitional period towards maybe a full resumption of the JCPOA agreement, both by Iran and also on the US. We are not expecting a full lifting of the sanction in the short term. That I think is probably not going to happen. The best that we can expect in the short and medium term is a partial lifting of those, if we manage to be successful. But then here again, I think we will, in this transitional period, we will see what are the first steps that the Biden administration will take. And here I agree that there are domestic issues in the political agenda of the Biden administration that will get a lot of his attention, and other international fronts, like it was mentioned before, like the big power competition, that will get probably his attention at the higher level that the issue in Iran. So let's see how fast this transition period would move. But I agree that probably we will get to this sequencing that was mentioning before, of trying to get back to the compliance for compliance, And what we as Europeans need to try to do, I would say, is to speed up that process as much as we can. And for that, I think that what is probably important for the coming weeks is to try to develop confidence building measures that would make that transition more smoothly. I think that probably the pandemic and combating the pandemic, which has been very dire in the country in the last months in Iran, and I'm referring, of course, offers an opportunity to try to open new channels of cooperation, maybe through the support of the COVAX initiative, to be more present in Iran. Maybe travel restrictions can be lifted, or maybe we can even go back and resuming the INSTEX activities and make them work better in order to try to develop those confidence building measures to make that transitional period to be shorter. But at the end of the day, if we manage to resume the JCPOA, and I think that this is still valid. I mean, I totally agree with the previous speakers that we also have the feeling that JCPOA is not enough, and I will mention something in relation to that. But JCPOA remains the most important tool that we have at the moment. It has proven to be the only tool so far to contain the Iranian nuclear program. And it is my impression as well that the Iranians continue to have interest in a JCPOA that works. You may correct me maybe later in the debate, but I think that this is still the only platform that offers the country some kind of political normalization and sanctions relief. We don't have any other tool so far. So I think that the framework of the JCPOA has to be preserved, and that's why I think that Europeans need to help resuming the talks and the conditions and the compliance on both sides. Now, beyond that, one of the things that the Parliament has been discussing a lot lately is the need to have a broader regional approach on the side of the Europeans. And I think that the European Union needs to understand, and one of the lessons it needs to take from what happened with the Trump administration is that it cannot wait for the US to get all the regional dynamics or just to side behind the initiatives of the US at the regional level. It has to have its own regional security approach. And for that, I think that we believe that in the coming months, the EU should intensify cooperation with other regional actors, and particularly the actors in the Gulf. And we have proposed a couple of occasions, even the appointment of a special high-level political envoy to coordinate those efforts. I think that the EU should develop further efforts in that relations in order to have a more autonomous and proactive strategy. And then again, I think another question that I think is extremely important is that we need to think the region beyond non-proliferation. This is something I think that needs to be present in our future developments with Iran and with the region. I mean, non-proliferation is an important component on our strategy on security, but we need to think about the environment, about migration, about the pandemic relief. I think that the new regional approach, which I think that is what we need at the moment, and that a new regional approach where we hope that the EU could be able to cooperate with the Americans, needs to have much broader agenda than just non-proliferation, which of course we understand will continue playing a central role. And finally, my last point is that I think that, and this has been mentioned before as well, all these elements need to be put in place in the coming months. We need results before the June elections in Iran, that everybody knows, and the country needs to receive signals that the West is ready to engage in a new dynamic before those elections, if we want to avoid a very negative outcome of the presidential elections. And for that, I think that once the new Biden administration is in place, I think that we will need to move faster than we probably have thought at the beginning. So voila, those are my first comments to start the discussion, and I'm more than ready to hear your questions, your comments, and to discuss. And thank you again for your invitation.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for this comprehensive points from the EU side. I actually have many points to pick up and many questions, but I'll maybe just stop at one regarding the other issues besides the nuclear deal. Does the EU have a strategy or plan to deal with these other issues, such as the human rights issues, the Iranian nuclear ballistic missile program, and the Iran's regional behavior? Does the EU have a plan to tackle this?
Well, I think it should have a plan. I think in the past, I think that the EU has been focused basically in the last months to try to help and secure JCPOA. I think the High Representative has been very engaged on that. Of course, we can discuss the results, but the political efforts have been, of course, put there. And of course, the human rights situation in Iran is something that has always worried the European Union. And I think that there is a permanent dialogue with Iranian authorities about that, and I think that this is an important component. But all the other elements, I think, and what I said from the beginning, I think that there is a lack of a more comprehensive strategy on all the other elements that would require a broader regional approach. Because I think as well that we are going to be able to build those this new confident dynamic if we are really able to show that we are ready to cooperate on all the different fields. Migration is one field, and environment is one field, and pandemic and the cooperation in relation to the pandemic offers other opportunities as well. So I think until now, my answer to your question would be no. I think that human rights in the country and JCPOA has been the main focus. But I think that a new regional approach on the side of the EU needs to broaden its agenda significantly.
Thank you. Now I'll just move to you, Aniseh. I know you also have other very relevant points as well. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mihai, and thank you very much to the previous speaker and to the Center for organizing this very timely and interesting discussion. A lot has been already said by the previous panelists, and I agree with a lot of what has been said. So I just add a few words on how I see the EU and US cooperation, especially in light of the Biden administration. First of all, credit where credit due. I think we have to stress that if there is still a JCPOA, at least institutionally, as Ernest was mentioning, it's also because of the commitment that the E3 and the EU have made over the past 3 years, so 2 years and a half in particular, when Trump left the deal. Obviously, like we have a weakened JCPOA. We are in a situation that very many of the European countries would not want to be in terms of where the nuclear activities of Iran are. But I think there has been a significant political commitment from the E3 and the EU. And this is definitely a testament to the JCPOA and the value of the agreement when it comes to its perceived contribution to non-proliferation concern on Iran, but also really a testament to what the E3 strategic objective have been and remains when it comes to Iran. So we can talk about whether they succeeded or not, as Ernest was mentioning, on basically going beyond just saving the JCPOA institutionally and ensuring that Iran complies with its own obligation. And obviously, I think there is a consensus that the record has not been as positive on that front, but in terms of political commitment, especially in 2018, 2019, I think the credit to the E3 should be really be due. This is especially the case given the challenges that the European side has faced over the past 4 years. It has faced a very unique position of being at odds with the United States, a position that the European capitals do not like. So what we have seen in the right aftermath of the election of President-elect Biden has been a deep sense of relief, a deep sigh, that came out even in a joint ministerial meeting statement back in December, where the prospect for a return of the US have been acknowledged, and there has been basically an expression of the readiness from all sides to have, for the first time in a long time, a joint effort on Iran. I think it has been really an incredible challenging 4 years from the European side. Not because just they have been misaligned from the US when it comes to their strategy and policy on Iran, but also because they had to face off, if you wish, maximum pressure and try at least to adopt an independent policy on Iran, which they have not been completely successful on. They obviously maintain a united front, which in itself should not have been taken for granted. There were a lot of debates about countries potentially breaking off ranks and sidelining with the US, or with maximum pressure. I mean, the UK is the main one, and we can talk about it maybe in the discussion more in detail. But I think the fact that the EU, the Israel maintained a united position really was quite significant, and really demonstrated the fact that the commitment to this agreement and to the strategic objective on Iran remain consistent across. I think the problem now is that obviously the natural tendency will be with the Biden administration to go back to previous patterns of transatlantic cooperation and a default position of a bridge building role between Iran and the United States. So, you know, like the European side will again facilitate negotiation and try to play its traditional role of finding a peaceful solution between the parties. This has been a strategy that has been adopted since 2006, at least 2006, so we can argue even earlier. So it's only normal that the Europeans will just go back to that kind of approach, which is frankly understandable. This has been also perceived as a much more effective policy and approach because there is a combination of tools between the United States and the European side with a shared strategy and the maximization basically of the chances of providing Iran with concrete incentives to comply with its own obligation and to negotiate in concrete terms. So even countries that have been very quiet, I would say, during the past 4 years, Italy being one, have been recently quite vocal about the appreciation that they have about these renewed engagement and renewed prospect for diplomacy and the JCPOA being strengthened, expressing their desire to and readiness to chip in if needed. So I think this is quite, I think, telling in terms of how much of a relief there is in European capitals about the fact that Biden has been elected, and there is now a prospect for transatlantic cooperation to be back in the game again. The problem with this, and I think I will build with on some of the points that Ernest was mentioning before, is that with the lesson learned over the past 4 years, I think there should be also a consideration of the fact that, yes, it will be easy and probably right to go into that kind of transatlantic cooperation, but that should not come at the expense of a continued investment into strategic autonomy. It's true that for the next 4 years, this is unlikely to be needed. Alignment with the US position is very likely. It seems to be quite normal that the European side and the US side will adopt a shared strategy on the nuclear issue. But I think we cannot really exclude that in 4 years' time, the EU is faced once again with a situation in which there is not only misalignment between the US and the EU, but also a challenge, direct challenge to the EU strategic interests because of the policies adopted by the US, being their sanctions or being them military initiatives which are not really in line with how the Europeans are seeing things in the region. So I think initiatives that have been started during the past few years, I mean, Ernest mentioned Instex, which is an important one, but I would also mention the European-led mission, the EMASO mission. These have been instruments which have been created specifically because of a divergent position between the EU and the so-called maximum pressure campaign. And the sense was that this policy adopted by the US was undermining EU strategic objective and something else was needed from the EU side. And I think that the tendency might be to just discard these tools completely, not to strengthen them, not to invest in them. And I think this would be a dangerous game because we would be in a situation in which, say, in 4 years' time, we have again a policy, might not be even Iran, but a policy on which the EU and the US do not agree. There wouldn't be the instruments in place once again for the European side to adopt an independent policy. So the limitations are there of these instruments, but instead of discarding these instruments, I think the Europeans should really invest on these tools, especially now that they have the space to do so, to make sure that when needed, they're ready to go. So yeah, I just wanted to stress that I think parallel work really should go hand in hand from one side in strengthening the transatlantic alliance from the European side, but also on investing on the strategic autonomy. And this also builds on what Ernest was mentioning on the potential to basically build into a much stronger, much more proactive role in the region. The Amazon mission could, for instance, be strengthened when it comes to its diplomatic track and engagement with regional countries. We know that in theory, this is the mandate, but in practice, very little has been done. So I think it would be right that instead of waiting for the US to take the lead on this, the EU does. Instead, we know that there needs to be a guarantor to bring the regional actors together and to start a conversation about potential areas of convergence. So I think it would be wise for the Europeans to try to take on that role. Otherwise, I think the risk is that the EU will continue to be dependent on what the US decides to do, specifically when it comes to Iran, and dependent on what sanctions are imposed, a secondary sanction, or whatsoever. And I think this would challenge the possibility of adopting and implementing properly its own strategic interest, as we have seen over the past 3 years. I will leave it here, but I'm happy to expand during the conversation. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for the new thoughts you brought in. Indeed, a lot has been said, but of course you managed to bring new points into the discussion. I just maybe would like to touch upon one issue before moving to the Q&A. With the UK outside of the EU, do you see a strategy for the UK to tackle the Iran? Do you see any, I don't know, strategic directions, or just UK will stick to the E3 group?
Yes, I think to the surprise of many, the UK actually has been quite consistent in being united with the E3. I think conversation and speculation about the E3, the UK breaking ranks with the E3 started in 2017, and obviously, were reinforced even more when, say, for instance, Prime Minister Boris Johnson was talking about the need for Trump to renegotiate the JCPOA, or when the UK decided not to take on its own position with the EU-led mission and instead join the US mission, maritime mission. So there were a lot of speculation about the fact that that meant a division between the UK and the E3. But I think what we have seen, in fact, over the past few years has been a strengthening of that kind of relation. And for the time being, I don't see any kind of disruption in that sense. In fact, if anything, because of Brexit, I think there is a tendency from the UK side to remain as closely as possible to the E3, to maintain a shared kind of strategy, because the strategic objective of the UK have been the same as France and Germany since 2003. This is when negotiations with Iran have started, and that has not changed. So it's really difficult to differentiate the UK from France and Germany, since that has been a work that has been ongoing for nearly 2 decades. What I would say, however, is that there is a stronger consideration about the needs and I would say the concerns of regional actors, being them Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and other in the region. So if from, I would say, the JCPOA front, there is going to be, I would say, a continuity between the UK and the E3 and the unity on that front, there is a possibility that the UK will engage more closely with regional countries when it comes to the ballistic missile issue and Iran's behavior in the region. I think this is a possibility.
Thank you very much for following up on my question. Now I would just slowly move into the Q&A session, and I know my colleague Amanda also has a lot of questions, so maybe I'll give the floor to her for an initial set of questions or questions. Over to you, Amanda.
Okay, I'm only going to ask one question because I know there's an audience that wants to ask questions. And my question is this: I mean, what happens in the worst case scenario if nothing is agreed before the Iranian elections and there is a conservative elected in Iran? What happens then? What can we expect, or can we expect nothing at all?
Maybe I'll just ask all of you for a quick thought on this. Maybe I'll start with you, Trita.
Sure, thank you. Wow, it will be a bad situation. There's very little reason to believe that the Iranians will not restart their program far more aggressively if there is no deal, and meaning that the sanctions are still in place. Even during the last years of the Obama administration, there were arguments in Tehran that Iran is already being sanctioned in a manner as if it had nuclear weapons. So it might as well get nuclear weapons as a deterrence and see if that actually would be something that would break the deadlock. So I think there's a tremendous amount of pressure to make sure that we avoid that scenario, because if we, even before we get to that scenario, the risk of war will significantly increase. And then we've already seen that quite clearly. So I think there's good reasons to put all the diplomatic political capital at play here and make sure that we can avoid that scenario.
Thank you, Trita. I'll just maybe just keep the initial order, and we'll go with you, Mike, and then with Mr. Urtasun, and then with Aniseh at the end. Please, over to you, Mike.
Sure, and I'll be brief. I think this is a key point of divergence amongst analysts in the U.S. I think those who want to see a quick return to the JCPOA want to see it in part because they believe that there is some urgency, whether related to Iran's commencement of 20% enrichment and other nuclear activities, or its political calendar. Whereas I think others like myself don't share this view of urgency and think we need to be careful not to sort of pressure ourselves in a sense with these things. My own view is that in Iran, yes, there are elections. Yes, those elections often both reflect and affect Iran's foreign policy decisions or behaviors towards other states. Ultimately, though, the decision will be in the hands of the supreme leader, who is not up for election. And I would say that if we're worried about a conservative being elected, a hardliner, as it were, in June, who won't be open to negotiations with the United States, well, that raises bigger questions for the strategy. Because remember, the objective for the Biden administration is not simply to re-enter the JCPOA, but to negotiate a deal which touches on the issues that my colleagues here have mentioned, missiles, regional issues, and so forth. A hardline president is probably more likely to re-enter the JCPOA than to be willing to make compromises on those issues, given that those are the areas in which institutions like the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, that is, play the strongest role. So if Iranian politics are going to be a concern, they'll be a concern no matter what the United States does in the first 5 months of the Biden presidency.
Thank you. Ernest, a quick thought on this?
My impression is that there will always be a room of negotiation with Iran and for resuming JCPOA before and after the elections, because it is in the interest of Iran. The economic situation is very dire, pandemic's hitting hard. There will be always an interest to negotiate. But I think that we do have an interest not to put ourselves into the position, not to put Europe and the US into the position having to deal with a more hardline administration in June, because we were not able to send any signal in the first 6 months. So I personally think it wouldn't close all the doors if nothing happens after June. There will still be a room of maneuver, but I think we have an interest in trying to influence positively those elections. That would make the life of the negotiations easy, I would say.
Thank you. Over to you, Aniseh.
Thank you. I mean, I agree with a lot that has been said, but I think I will try to reverse the question and say that I think there is still a possibility that negotiation will happen, but I think learning from the past, there would be a significant change in the Iranian posture towards, generally speaking, the West. It's not just about the nuclear issue, but towards basically the adoption of the tactical approach towards the same red lines, because Mike is right, is the supreme leader that in the end decides the red lines, but there are differences when it comes to tactical approaches, as we have seen, for instance, between the Khatami presidency and the Ahmadinejad presidency or the Rouhani presidency, even when just looking at the nuclear issue. So I think there will be a different tactical approach. The bigger risk of nothing happening between now and the election is, in my opinion, that each side will try instead to increase its own leverage ahead of talks. And instead of seizing the opportunity, there will be push for each side to intensify the blaming game. And this, I think, will potentially further erode the trust that has been completely eroded over the past 4 years. So if on one side we could see the intensification of the Iranian nuclear activities that we have seen over the past few weeks when it comes to 20% enriched uranium, work on a uranium metal, and so on and so forth, I think the other side could also play that card, and that would probably make it more difficult to move towards diplomatic engagement moving forward. That is my concern.
Thank you very much, and also thank you to you, Amanda, for the question. Now we shall move to the Q&A, and we have a first question from Mr. Mateusz Piotrowski, who asks, what role may China play in bringing Iran back to the JCPOA? How China, or will China influence this process? How can it influence it? And I'll leave it maybe up to you who would like to take the question.
So I'll take a crack at it. Why not? I think that there is going to be a significant difference between the role we saw Russia and China play in the negotiations in the 2010s and the role that they play going forward. And that has less to do with the development of their relations with Iran, although those have been significant in some ways, and that's a broader topic in a sense, and more to do with the obviously very fraught and contentious great power relations we see on the world stage today. If you look at the UN Security Council, for example, the number of vetoes exercised in the UN Security Council has increased dramatically. And that points to the sort of rise, not just of strategic competition between great powers, but really the sort of decline of great power diplomacy. And it's telling also and troubling also that the Russians and Chinese, for example, did not sign on to a statement with the E3 condemning Iran's move to enrich uranium to 20%. So I think we can expect to see Russia and China certainly not stand in the way of compliance for compliance deal, which would be in their interest, but to also not necessarily play a helpful role to the United States and Europe in any subsequent negotiations which take place. I think we should be under no illusions that we are not on the same side, as it were, on these other issues, even if we all share an interest in non-proliferation. What does that mean? It means, I think, that ultimately this issue might unfortunately be a function of the broader relations between the West and Russia and China.
Thank you, Mike. Trita, you also had a comment on this?
No, it's good. Thank you.
It's good. Okay. Then we'll just move to another question from Mr. David Ibsen, the president of United Against Nuclear Iran. I'll just read it out loud. The question is to you, Mike. So you have suggested that Iran's announcement of plans to enrich uranium up to 20% should be understood as an attempt to pressure the incoming Biden administration to drop any notions of renegotiating or strengthening the JCPOA and instead return to it as quickly as possible. If this is the case, how would you advise the Biden administration to respond?
Well, it may be more interesting to get others' views on this, because I think probably I've already articulated my view, which is, I think that these are tactics by Iran to increase pressure on the Biden administration to simply prefer a straightforward return to the JCPOA, because undoubtedly the Iranians are aware that there is this debate in Washington over using the sanctions leverage that the Trump administration is, in a sense, bequeathing to the Biden administration. My own view is that we need to have the kind of intestinal fortitude to ignore these things or to treat them as the violations of the deal that they are, rather than allow ourselves to sort of be pressured to make decisions that we might not otherwise make. There is also an Iranian domestic political context here. I maybe let others comment on that, but these are steps that obviously the modulus in Iran and I think hardliners in Iran are trying to force on the Rouhani administration. But I think it's important that we sort of not allow these types of things to sort of induce a state of panic, as it were, amongst the E3 in the United States.
Thank you, Mike. Are there any other comments on this
Okay,
question?
if I could add one aspect to what Michael said. The domestic political element of this is not just that the Majlis and the hardliners there, which is controlled by the hardliners, maybe pushing for this at an earlier point, whether it would be to undermine Rouhani, whether it would be to strengthen negotiations vis-a-vis the United States if the US was not going to go for a compliance for compliance. I think it's also a lot of posturing. I think there is a consensus being built in Washington and in Tehran for compliance in order to give the impression that the Iranians are going into this from a position of strength. I think there's a choreography of such measures that are very easily reversible that is being made right now to kind of leave an impression of strength, which is not necessarily targeting the United States or the E3, but it is more targeting domestic audience inside of Iran.
You know, Mihai, I'd just say one thing in response to what Trita said, which is, I think that one thing that we need to bear in mind, you know, anyone who's negotiating with Iran or dealing with Iran, I mentioned before that, well, the Supreme Leader has the ultimate decision. That's something Aniseh said as well. But you still see within the scope of that decision, this competition amongst different institutions in Iran for how they're going to go about affecting it. I think you see, for example, hardliners and hardline institutions like the Revolutionary Guards basically doing things to try to seize the initiative bureaucratically, as it were. That's kind of an anodyne way of putting it. You can see it in the case of this, for example, South Korean freighter that was just captured, as it were, by the Iranians. You had a negotiation going on between the Rouhani administration and Seoul on this issue. And in a sense, you see the IRGC sort of impose itself in the midst of that. You know, I think the Western tendency is to say, well, how do we kind of play this chessboard and favor one side over the other? I think the reality is that efforts to do that usually are fruitless, and we have to accept that this is going to go on in our dealings with the Iranians, that this is going to be part of what we face in any type of issue that we try to negotiate with Iran on.
Thank you, Mike. Maybe I'll just have also a follow-up question to Trita, also related to this. Let's just maybe assume for 1 second that Iran rejects the conditions set by US for its return to the nuclear deal. Where does this leave the US? What options has the Biden administration to tackle this?
Well, if the conditions are compliance for compliance, the Iranians have already clearly signaled that that is something they favored. In fact, I think they used the language even before the Biden administration used that language. So I see this as a rather unlikely scenario, but let's assume that something like that would happen. Part of the challenge for the Biden administration is that what Trump did with the sanctions and how so many of the Biden administration's own people are on record rejecting maximum pressure, pointing out that it was a failure, pointing out that it only made matters worse, it can leave the Biden administration in a rather difficult position, because if the Iranians are not going forward with compliance for compliance, if the US feels that its approach to, there is no other way diplomatically to finesse this, well, then the sanctions path is going to be rather difficult for them to pursue. Partly because they're on record saying that it doesn't work, partly because Trump has already shown that that massive degree of pressure did not work and did not change the Iranian position, but also because I find it extremely unlikely that the Biden administration would be able to muster the same degree of economic pressure on Iran, for the very simple reason that Trump was extremely reckless in the manner that he did these sanctions. He was obsessed with Iran, and he was willing to sacrifice a whole set of other interests, including relations between the US and the EU, etc., in order to be able to muster that degree of unlikely that the administration would be able to follow that path and be able to echo what Trump did and that degree of recklessness. And as a result, I don't find it likely they will be able to get the same degree of economic pain. And even if they did, we've already seen that that has not worked. So I think the diplomatic path and finding some way of making it work is not only the most attractive path for the Biden administration, it may also be the only one that would not involve any kind of a kinetic force.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Trita. Now there is one more question in the chat box, but it's addressed to you, Trita. But maybe before moving to that, I would just have a question for Ernest and Aniseh. Back in 2015, after the nuclear deal was set, there was this discussion in Europe about the openness of the Iranian economic sector to European companies. And there was a lot of attractiveness back then, but this has kind of gone away with the years. Do you see a return to this? Do you see like a future where European companies could be present in Iran? Do you see like a return to this mindset? Who would like to go first?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I would like to stress one thing about that. I don't think the economy is really the leading factor of the European kind of drive to engage with Iran. Has been perceived and described often as so, but I think it's, the reality is that it's perceived as a tool to get into addressing the strategic interest being, the nuclear issue, or getting Iran to comply with say the Yemen file through the E4 negotiation and so on and so forth. Especially after 2010, when the first set of unilateral sanctions has been imposed. We have seen 2012, the imposition of the oil embargo, cutoff of SWIFT, all of that. I think really the bulk of EU trade with Iran has really been reduced significantly. Yes, as you described, Mihai, there has been a flood of interest in the aftermath of the implementation of the JCPOA, so 2016, early 2016, late 2016. But I think for that to become an essential part of the bilateral engagement, it will really need to become something different as an environment. Go back to pre-2010 framework. And I think for now, this is not really a priority in my view. I think for that to happen, you would need from the European side, from the European company side, not just the executive orders to be lifted, as Mike was mentioning, but something more stable, something that allows for European companies to project their plans in a longer term, not in just one administration term. I'm talking especially for companies that are looking into investment and not just into short-term trade. So I think, yes, small-scale trade, it's likely to increase, but I don't see really the flood of interest and return into the Iranian economy. Because that has really been not part of the priorities for a very long time.
Over to you, Ernest. Any thoughts on this?
I basically agree with Aniseh. I think that the main element of the European approach to Iran is political, is regional security. I don't think the business agenda is at the core of that. There was, of course, a lot of talk around it in 2015 to 2016, but then when the Trump administration came and the sanctions were reimposed, the EU tried to put in place, as I mentioned before, mechanisms for the companies to operate in Iran, overcoming those sanctions, but those operations were extremely limited. We almost haven't had operators using insects or other instruments trying to operate in Iran. So, and this comes to the second element that was mentioned by Aniseh, which I think is important. I think those operators, we can only expect them to go back if there is a stable political environment that is credible in the more long term. And that is something that we need to be aware. Again, if the impression is that the talks and the agreements and the resumption of the JCPOA is as unstable as it has been in the last years, I think this component it's not gonna work. It's simply not gonna work. So I think this is something to bear in mind.
I will just maybe now move back to the Q&A, and just going back to a question for you, Trita, from Eldar Mamedov, who's like a senior advisor for European Parliament. I'll just read it out. It's a longer question. So Quincy Institute has established itself in a short time as a voice for realism and restraint in US foreign policy. It seems that voices in favor of a less interventionist American foreign policy in the Middle East are gaining more prominence in both main political parties in the US. Do you foresee that with time this can lead to a substantial shift in the US policy towards Iran, more in favor of diplomatic engagement rather than focus on sanctions and isolation of Iran?
Thank you so much. Eldar, as always, asks great questions. I think, yes, I think if we first take a look at how the demographics of the United States is changing and the attitudes of the younger generation of Americans towards foreign policy, the trend is quite clear. There's an excellent article on Carnegie Endowment's website this week about the foreign policy of Gen Z. And one of the key things there, of course, is the greater focus on fixing things in the United States, a significant loss of confidence in American exceptionalism as something that should be guiding the US, a belief that the United States has a lot to learn, not just a lot to offer, really a much more humble foreign policy that is quite allergic to both military interventions as well the idea that for the security of the United States to be established, dominance of various regions is necessary. In the Middle East, if such sentiments were to influence the foreign policy, we would be moving away from the idea that the US needs to sustain or try to sustain any form of hegemony in the Middle East. And part of the challenge from moving away from that posture actually has been tensions between the United States and Iran. I'll guide you to, I think either in the article or in the interview about the article that Jake Sullivan gave last summer, who's now going to be Biden's national security advisor, he pointed to the fact that being able to have a much lesser military footprint in the Middle East necessitated some form of an agreement with Iran on the nuclear issue, precisely because of the fact, and this I'm adding my own analysis here, that the nuclear program was the main factor that could drag the United States back into the region militarily, the main factor that could cause another war that the US would be involved in. So in order to be able to reduce the military footprint and move towards a foreign policy that is favored, not just by the Gen Z, but increasingly by a majority of Americans, some form of agreement with Iran was needed in order to be able to pave the way for that. I think that stands true, and I suspect that the trend in American foreign policy, although it will not be straight, there will be bumps, is going in that direction. And that will create further domestic political pressure to be able to find a political solution. I agree with Michael that as things stand right now in the Republican Party, this issue has been tremendously politicized, even more so now than before because of Trump. I think it will be quite fascinating to see how it will be viewed in a couple of months, particularly if Trump no longer is a decisive factor in the Republican Party, or if he ends up becoming a decisive factor, one of many, rather than the sole one as he is right now. Moreover, I think expanding the negotiations that would address some of the concerns, such as the restrictions on the program, missiles, etc., could not only open up for support from some Republicans in Congress, but particularly if you also add that what the US would offer as an incentive would be to lift the primary sanctions, which then would allow American companies to be able to enter the Iranian market. I think then there again, there could be openings on the Republican side that could break the current political deadlock in Congress in regards to this issue.
Thank you, Trita. Mike, do you have any thoughts on this, or we can move forward?
I think Trita planted that question about the Quincy Institute, but
I didn't. I swear.
Look, I don't necessarily share the same sort of point of view that that the Quincy Institute has. I think we can agree, though, that it is the case that the United States needs to expand its sort of arsenal of policy tools beyond just sort of whatever happens to be favored at the moment. Sometimes diplomacy is favored. Sometimes sanctions are favored, and there was a time when military intervention was favored. And we're going to be successful when we learn to wield these things together in a sensible and sort of sustainable way, where our ends match our means, and we're willing to, as I said, sort of wield tools in a non-biased way to accomplish those things. I personally am all for more diplomacy, and I'm all for using the tools of deterrence rather than the tools of intervention. am not optimistic, however, that we are going to be able to solve our problems or extricate ourselves from the Middle East with any particular agreement or policy initiative, only because I think, look, our interests there remain compelling, and the alternatives for accomplishing them, say working strictly through allies, at this stage are simply not sufficiently well developed. We could have a nuclear agreement with Iran. We could have a stronger nuclear agreement with Iran, and I would be in favor of that. But that wouldn't mean that U.S. troops could leave Syria or U.S. troops could leave Iraq very easily. And so the idea that it's going to prevent an American war in the Middle East, well, we're at war in the Middle East. And as much as we like to block that out of our minds, it's the reality. And I haven't heard President-elect Biden say he wants to withdraw troops from Iraq or Syria. And so I think that's the messy reality that we face in the Middle East, and it will be for some time.
Since we still have a couple of minutes on the clock, there is one last question from my colleague Reka Kolesar from the Europe in the World program at the EPC. And she's asking, how will the Biden administration deal with the sunset clauses in the JCPOA? The UN restrictions on conventional arms trade has already expired in October, and the Trump administration issued an executive order to threaten with sanctions for any arms sales. Russia has already stated its willingness to sell arms to Iran as the embargo expired. And I'll just leave it up to you, to who wants to tackle this question.
I can just add a couple of comments on it. I think I mentioned it earlier on in my opening presentation. The way that Biden administration will be dealing with some of these issues, some of them I think they agree with, some of them perhaps less so, but the strategy is to first make sure that the JCPOA is restored, compliance for compliance once it is established, then begin add-on negotiations that address these issues. Those add-on negotiations will address many of the things that was mentioned here. I don't know if the arms embargo is necessarily going to be one of them at the beginning, but there will be regional issues as well. But they will be add-on agreements, and as such, their success or failure should not necessarily impact the survival of the JCPOA. But from what we have seen, what they've said publicly and some things privately, I think it's quite clear that the administration of Biden is going to seek to address many of those issues, but from within the JCPOA rather than from the outside.
If I could just chime in, Mihai, look, I think it's a shame that we agreed to these sunsets as part of the JCPOA without getting any kind of commitment from Iran to exercise restraint in these areas, because, as I mentioned before, these were prohibitions enshrined in UN Security Council resolutions that we aren't going to get back. The fact is that geopolitics has changed, and we're not going to get Russia and China to sign on to a new UN Security Council resolution that reimposes, an arms embargo on Iran or ballistic missile restrictions on Iran, at least not in the foreseeable future. Ultimately, what matters is the reality on the ground. And so there are ways to shape the reality on the ground that the Biden administration will have available to it, whether that's diplomatic understandings with Iran's likely arms suppliers, Russia and China, whether it's the enforcement of other UN embargoes, for example, the provision of weapons to parties in the conflicts in Yemen and Syria and Lebanon and so forth, or whether it's Iranian restraint in the various ways that can be accomplished, whether through diplomacy or deterrence. The sunset I'm worried about the most, although the arms embargo sunset was unfortunate, and I've written a bit about that, is really the ballistic missile sunset. Because if you remember how the North Korea issue sort of unfolded, North Korea was working obviously on uranium enrichment, plutonium reprocessing, but what really brought the crisis to a head was its work on ICBMs, on intercontinental ballistic missiles, in combination with its nuclear capabilities. And I think that if we saw Iran move towards that kind of capability, which I think is not at this stage within its sort of realm of capability, but could be with outside support, that I think would really increase the risk of conflict between the United States and Iran, and frankly, not just the United States and Iran, but other countries would come into that mix as well. That happens, I think, in 2021, 2020. Well, I don't remember off the top of my head when that sunset happens. Maybe somebody else does. But that's a date that the Biden administration has to have circled on the calendar.
Are there any other comments to this issue?
I mean, very quickly, just as I know that you're running out of time, I think what Trita has laid out as the approach of the Biden administration is at the moment also the approach that has been brought in from the E3 side. You know, there is talks about a nuclear agreement plus. There are already talks about that. So there is, I think, broader consideration about not looking just at the expiration of the 2025 obligations for Iran and the end of the JCPOA by then. But I think before going into the nuclear agreement plus, there is a sense that first the compliance for compliance should be achieved, because then the risk is otherwise to, as I said before, a further intensification of the Iranian nuclear activities, a further intensification of the risk of non-proliferation. And this is something that the European side are trying to discourage as much as possible.
Thank you. I know we're a bit running over time, but just to end in a good note, because we have discussed many aspects, I think we can do one event for each aspect we discussed today. I'll maybe just ask each of you to state one or two most important things that we need to follow in the next few months regarding Iran. One or maximum two issues very briefly. And maybe I'll start in the initial order that we started the event with you, Trita.
I would keep an eye on how the Biden administration is going to be dealing with the Prime Minister of Israel as well as with Saudi Arabia. It's going to be a very critical element of how the approach to Iran will end up being implemented. The opposition to it from those corners is obviously extremely fierce, and precisely because of the importance of domestic politics in the United States, how the Biden administration manages to insulate the diplomacy with Iran from attacks from elements who oppose it is going to be critical. The other thing, of course, is what we already talked about, is how the narrative evolves in Iran and how the Iranian elections end up, what the results of those elections, which of course will be quite important for the future of any post-JCPOA negotiations. Over
to you, Mike.
Thanks, Mihai. I think that the one thing I think people need to bear in mind is the JCPOA is not Iran policy, that American policy towards Iran is going to need to encompass much more than just nuclear negotiations. And ultimately, so much of the difficulty we have with Iran actually sort of stems from instability and sort of state weakness in the Middle East. And so whatever we do on the nuclear negotiations, the Biden administration is going to need to nest it, as it were, in a sort of robust Middle East policy, but one which, again, doesn't distract them or derail them from their broader strategic priorities. And I think in a way that's going to be the more difficult task, more difficult than approaching the nuclear negotiations.
Ernest, over to you.
But I agree. I think that what I'm interested to see is what are going to be the main priorities of the Biden administration for policy in the coming months, and not only Iran. What are the next steps going to be in the whole regional geopolitical changes prompted by the Trump administration the last months? I think this is absolutely linked to the future of the JCPOA. So getting to know how fast Biden will move and how much is he willing to change many of the decisions taken by the former administration. I think this is absolutely something that will be key. Then, of course, as far as I'm concerned, let's see what the Europeans are willing to do in that kind of transitional period, as I mentioned at the beginning. And then last but not least, I think in Iran, we have to keep an eye on the economy and the evolution of the pandemic. This is going to be extremely important.
And last but not least?
I think the sequencing will be the crucial element to look. Like we know, by now we know that there is a readiness by all sides to start diplomacy again. I think there is an understanding of the challenges faced by all sides to get there. But I think we are in a better position than we were in 2013. There was no agreement whatsoever. We didn't have a blueprint. There was nothing to start from. So I think there is, there is a lot of challenges there, but there is also some optimism that at least there is a starting point. I think the key will be how to get there and how to move forward. So the sequencing, I think, in my opinion, will be the crucial aspect.
Thank you. I would just like to take this opportunity to thank you all for joining us today from both sides of the Atlantic. Also, thank you very much to our participants, and I'm looking forward to our future events on Iran and on Middle East.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
very
you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.